You don't own your home. You don't own your car. You don't even own the things you've already paid for. Ownership didn't collapse. It was redesigned. For most of modern history, ownership marked the end of a transaction. You paid once, received the asset, and the relationship dissolved. Control moved downstream. Responsibility followed it. Whatever happened next belonged to the owner, not the system that sold it. That finality mattered. It meant independence from renegotiation. It meant stability without ongoing permission. It meant that once something was paid for, nothing more was required. But finality is inefficient. Ownership ends revenue. It ends leverage. It ends dependency. Once a transaction is complete, the system loses influence over what happens next. And over time, systems began to optimize against that outcome. This shift didn't require intention. It didn't require coordination. It emerged naturally as markets evolved toward predictability, scale, and control. When revenue models changed, ownership quietly became unnecessary. Not immoral, not illegal, just obsolete. The systems that survived longest were the ones that never allowed relationships to end. Housing was the first place where this became impossible to ignore. For generations, home ownership was the anchor of economic life. A home was shelter, but also equity, leverage, and long-term security. You bought once, paid down debt over time, and eventually reached permanence. The cost of living declined as income rose. Stability increased with age. Ownership created an endpoint. That endpoint became the weakness. As populations grew and housing supply failed to keep pace, prices rose. As prices rose faster than wages, down payments moved further out of reach. At the same time, access to capital consolidated upward, where scale mattered more than residence. Large buyers saw what individuals could not compete with. Housing produced stable cash flow. It appreciated slowly. It could be pooled, insured, financed, and modeled. Risk could be diversified. Maintenance could be standardized. Rent never stopped. From a system perspective, renting outperformed selling. It eliminated finality. It converted shelter into a perpetual income stream. It centralized control while shifting volatility outward. Ownership fragmented value across millions of households. Renting concentrated it. This didn't require banning ownership. It required making it less accessible. As competition intensified and prices rose, renting stopped being temporary and became structural. Not because people preferred it, but because the system rewarded it. The language stayed familiar. People still lived in homes. They still paid monthly. But the relationship changed. Instead of ownership marking independence from the market, occupancy became a condition of permanent participation. The home no longer represented an endpoint. It represented ongoing exposure. Transportation followed the same pattern. Buying a car once meant autonomy. Once paid off, the vehicle represented sunk cost. Repairs were local. Decisions were personal. The manufacturer exited the relationship. That model capped revenue and limited influence. Financing softened the endpoint. Leasing normalized impermanence. Software eliminated finality altogether. Modern vehicles are not static machines. They are controlled systems. Hardware exists, but behavior is governed by software layers managed upstream. Features can be activated or restricted remotely. Performance can be limited by subscription. Updates are mandatory. Repairs are constrained. Data flows continuously back to the manufacturer. Ownership of the physical object no longer guarantees control over its function. The driver becomes a licensed participant in a managed platform. This is presented as progress. Predictable payments, included services, seamless updates, reduced responsibility. But structurally, the transaction no longer ends. Even when the loan is paid off, the relationship persists. The vehicle remains part of a system that can change unilaterally. Autonomy becomes conditional. Software made this transition unavoidable elsewhere. Software was once a product. You purchased a version, installed it, and used it until it failed. Updates were optional. Files belonged to you. The transaction ended at purchase. That model created friction for providers. Revenue was irregular. Piracy was common. Support extended beyond payment. Control ended at distribution. Subscriptions solved those problems completely. Access replaced ownership, licensing replaced transfer, authentication replaced permanence. Today, most software is never owned. It exists behind accounts, terms, and ongoing validation. Files may remain on a device, but functionality depends on permission. Miss a payment and access ends. Change terms and behavior changes retroactively. Discontinue support and the product effectively disappears. Payment is no longer tied to value delivered. It is tied to time elapsed. The user does not buy software. The user maintains eligibility. entertainment completed the transition with almost no resistance. Music, films, and television once existed as physical collections. Ownership was explicit. Libraries were permanent. Access was unconditional. Digital distribution weakened permanence. Streaming eliminated it. Today, entertainment exists behind subscriptions. Catalogs rotate. Content disappears without notice. Access depends on licensing agreements and platform policy. There is no archive, no guarantee, no endpoint. What appears abundant is conditional. The platform retains control. The user retains nothing. These systems did not converge by accident. Each followed the same incentive structure independently. Ownership ends relationships. Access extends them. Ownership caps revenue. Subscriptions compound it. Ownership decentralizes control. Services retain it. Markets reward what persists. Over time, systems built around continuity outperformed those built around completion. Investors favored predictable cash flows. Platforms favored retention. Institutions favored leverage. Ownership became inefficient, not because it failed, but because it could not scale. Friction was engineered out. This is why the end of ownership doesn't feel dramatic, it feels ordinary. Each change appears incremental. Each trade-off feels reasonable. Each loss is small enough to ignore, but the cumulative effect is structural. Most people now live inside systems they do not control. They participate continuously in arrangements that never terminate. They pay not to acquire, but to remain. The object may still exist, control does not, and this is only the beginning. This transition does not announce itself as loss. It presents itself as flexibility. Systems emphasize convenience, lower upfront costs, fewer responsibilities, seamless upgrades, continuous improvement. Each benefit is real in isolation. Together, they normalize dependence. When ownership disappears, the burden of permanence shifts. Instead of bearing responsibility once, individuals bear obligation indefinitely. Instead of paying to finish, they pay to continue. The difference matters. Ownership creates insulation. It limits exposure to renegotiation. It allows planning without constant reassessment. Access requires continuous compliance. Every month becomes a checkpoint. Every update becomes a revision of terms. Every platform change ripples downstream. The system can adapt instantly. The participant cannot. This imbalance becomes more visible as access expands beyond products into everyday infrastructure. Devices no longer function independently. Phones, appliances, security systems, and vehicles rely on accounts, authentication, and cloud services. Hardware exists locally, authority does not. A device may sit on a desk, but its usefulness depends on remote systems that can change or disappear without notice. Ownership of the object does not guarantee ownership of its function. This logic extends into work. Tools required for modern employment, software suites, communication platforms, cloud services are rented, not owned. Skills become tethered to licensed environments. Output exists within proprietary systems. Employment itself increasingly mirrors access rather than ownership. Contracts replace careers. Flexibility replaces permanence. Stability depends on continued eligibility. Work becomes participation in systems that can revoke access at any moment. The relationship never ends. Education follows the same pattern. Learning once meant acquiring knowledge that remained usable indefinitely. Skills accumulated, credentials persisted. Now, credentials expire. Platforms gate access to learning materials. Certifications require renewal. Tools evolve faster than mastery. Education becomes a subscription to relevance rather than a foundation of competence. Knowledge itself becomes provisional. Even finance reflects this shift. Credit replaces saving. Renting replaces buying. Monthly payments replace completion. Access to money becomes conditional on participation in scoring systems that constantly reevaluate worthiness. Debt persists. Ownership recedes. Every system trends toward continuity because continuity stabilizes revenue and centralizes control. This structure reshapes how risk is distributed. Under ownership, risk is localized. A buyer absorbs loss but also gains autonomy. Under access, risk is diffused downward. Systems retain flexibility. Individuals absorb volatility. When costs rise, prices adjust. When terms change, users comply or exit. When support ends, functionality vanishes. The system remains insulated. The participant remains exposed. This exposure compounds over time. Because access never ends, costs accumulate indefinitely. A subscription that feels minor monthly becomes substantial over decades. A rental that feels flexible becomes permanent. Ownership once front-loaded cost and minimized long-term exposure. Access inverts that equation. Low entry, infinite duration. This inversion is subtle but powerful. People adapt to monthly payments more easily than large purchases. Systems exploit that preference. Over time, total cost becomes secondary to immediate affordability. This is not manipulation, it is optimization. Markets respond to behavior, not intention. As long as access feels easier than ownership, systems will provide access. As long as continuity generates more value than completion, ownership will remain marginal. The result is not deprivation, it is dependency. A person may access more than ever before, more media, more tools, more services, but control diminishes. Choice exists within constraints, freedom exists within frameworks. The boundaries are invisible because they are normalized. This normalization alters expectations across generations. Ownership once marked adulthood. It signaled arrival. It represented stability. Access reframes adulthood as ongoing participation. Stability becomes conditional. Progress becomes indefinite. There is no point of arrival, only maintenance. This has psychological consequences. Planning becomes provisional. Commitments feel risky. Permanence feels unattainable or unnecessary. Why own when systems discourage it? Why settle when access remains flexible? The system does not require answers, it functions regardless. As ownership recedes, leverage consolidates. Those who control platforms accumulate data, influence, and pricing power. Those who participate remain interchangeable. Exit becomes costly, alternatives narrow. Switching friction increases. Lock-in replaces loyalty. This is not enforced, it is engineered. The longer one participates, the harder it becomes to leave. Data accumulates, habits form, dependencies deepen. Ownership once offered an escape from this dynamic. Access embeds it. And as more aspects of life adopt access-based models, the cumulative effect reshapes society itself. Stability becomes external. Security depends on uninterrupted participation. Independence becomes theoretical. The system does not collapse under this structure, it stabilizes. It is resilient because it never resolves. Ownership resolved transactions. Access sustains them. This is why the transition accelerates rather than reverses. Once systems reorganize around continuity, reverting to completion undermines the entire structure. Markets resist that reversal, not because ownership is impossible, but because it is inefficient within the new framework. Ownership requires trust in downstream users. Access retains authority upstream. Systems choose authority. And individuals adapt. They rent longer, subscribe more, license everything, accept terms they never read, not because they are unaware, but because alternatives disappear. This is the environment that now feels normal. Most people do not notice the shift because nothing was taken away all at once. Each step added convenience. Each trade-off seemed optional. But when combined, the outcome is permanent. Ownership did not fail. It was outperformed. And as systems continue optimizing toward continuity, the gap widens. Ownership becomes rare. Access becomes universal, not as a policy, but as a consequence. And this sets the stage for what comes next. Because when ownership disappears quietly, its absence is inherited, not by choice, but by default. What happens next is not sudden, it is inherited. When ownership disappears quietly, its absence does not register as loss to the people living through the transition. It registers as normal to the people who arrive after it. This is how systems become permanent. For earlier generations, ownership was an expectation. It shaped timelines. You rented briefly, then bought. You leased temporarily, then owned. You paid off debts, then costs declined. Stability increased with age. That pattern no longer holds. For the next generation, ownership is not delayed. It is optional at best, inaccessible at worst, and unnecessary by design. They are not moving toward ownership. They are entering systems where ownership is no longer required for participation, and therefore no longer prioritized. Housing is the clearest signal. Younger generations are not renting because they prefer flexibility. They are renting because ownership no longer functions as a reachable endpoint. Prices outpace wages, supply remains constrained, institutional ownership absorbs inventory, renting becomes permanent, not through choice, but through structure. The system no longer expects transition. A renter is not a future owner delayed. A renter is a stable revenue participant. That expectation changes behavior upstream. Developers build for renters, not owners. Investors optimize for yield, not turnover. Policy adapts to maintenance of tenancy rather than facilitation of purchase. Ownership becomes an exception rather than a path. Transportation follows. Younger consumers do not expect to own cars outright. They expect monthly payments, managed access, bundled services. Vehicles become interchangeable utilities rather than personal assets. Autonomy becomes less relevant than availability. If access is reliable, permanence feels unnecessary. Software, tools, and entertainment reinforce this expectation early. A generation raised on subscriptions does not experience loss when ownership disappears. They experience inconvenience when access is interrupted. The relationship flips. Ownership once defined control. Access now defines normality. This alters how leverage accumulates. When ownership is widespread, value disperses. When access dominates, value concentrates. Equity once flowed downstream through ownership of homes, businesses, tools, and intellectual property. That equity created buffers, mobility, and intergenerational transfer. Access does not create equity, it creates continuity. Payments accumulate outward, assets accumulate upward. This does not require exploitation, it requires patience. Systems that retain ownership outlast individuals who merely access them. Over decades, this dynamic compounds. Those who own platforms accumulate data, pricing power, and behavioral insight. Those who participate remain legible, predictable, and replaceable. The system becomes more stable as individuals become more dependent. This dependence reshapes decision-making. Long-term planning becomes fragile when access can be revoked. Commitments feel riskier when costs never resolve. Permanence becomes harder to justify when nothing is owned outright. As a result, timelines shift. People delay milestones not because they reject them, but because the system no longer supports them. Marriage, children, geographic roots. These once aligned with ownership. Without ownership, they become negotiable. Flexibility replaces stability as the default value. But flexibility benefits systems more than individuals. Systems can pivot instantly. Individuals absorb transition costs. This imbalance is subtle, but cumulative. Each subscription reduces margin. Each rental removes equity. Each license replaces control with permission. None of these are catastrophic alone. Together, they redefine adulthood. The result is not despair, it is normalization. People adjust expectations downward without recognizing the structural cause. They internalize the outcome as personal circumstance rather than systemic design. Ownership feels aspirational instead of expected. This perception shift is crucial. Once ownership is framed as optional, its absence no longer triggers resistance. The system stabilizes. Markets adapt to expectations faster than expectations adapt to markets. Over time, the idea of owning less feels less like loss and more like maturity. Why commit when access is sufficient? Why accumulate when systems update automatically? Why anchor when mobility is rewarded? These questions are never asked explicitly, they are answered behaviorally. The system does not need consensus, it needs compliance. Compliance emerges naturally when alternatives fade. This is why the end of ownership does not provoke revolt, it produces adaptation. People rearrange lives around access rather than permanence. They budget for continuity rather than completion. They measure success by participation rather than possession, and systems reward that adjustment. Employment adapts accordingly. Jobs increasingly provide access to benefits without ownership of outcomes. Skills remain platform-dependent. Output exists within proprietary ecosystems. Careers fragment into roles. Roles dissolve into contracts. Contracts renew conditionally. Work becomes access to income streams rather than ownership of production. Once again, the relationship never ends. Education reflects this shift. Credentials no longer represent durable knowledge. They represent temporary alignment with current systems. Certifications expire. Skills require constant updating. Learning becomes a subscription to relevance. The endpoint disappears. Knowledge becomes provisional. Competence becomes conditional. Even financial security adapts. Saving becomes less effective when assets are inaccessible. Investing becomes abstract when participation is intermediated. Retirement becomes dependent on systems that must continue functioning. Ownership once insulated individuals from systemic volatility. Access ties individuals to it. The future becomes contingent. This contingency does not collapse trust immediately. It erodes it slowly. People stop expecting permanence. They stop assuming continuity. They plan around instability. This planning feeds back into the system. When people do not expect ownership, demand for it weakens. When demand weakens, supply shifts further toward access models. The loop tightens. This is how systems entrench themselves without force, not by removing options, but by reshaping expectations. Over time, ownership becomes symbolic rather than functional, a marker of status rather than security. Those who own stand apart. Those who access remain within. This separation does not require explicit barriers. It emerges through pricing, availability, and design. Ownership persists, but only for those who can absorb its upfront costs and opportunity costs. Everyone else participates indefinitely. This is not a dystopia. It is a stable equilibrium, a system where continuity matters more than completion, where relationships never resolve, where dependency is normalized. And because it functions smoothly, it persists. The danger is not collapse. It is quiet permanence. A generation raised entirely within access-based systems will not miss ownership. They will not demand it. They will design around its absence. At that point, reversal becomes theoretical because systems do not return to inefficiency voluntarily. Ownership required trust in individuals. Access retains authority within institutions. Authority does not decentralize itself. This is the inheritance taking shape, not because someone chose it explicitly, but because it was the logical outcome of decades of optimization. And once inherited, it no longer feels imposed. It feels like the way things work. At a certain point, a system no longer needs to justify itself. Once enough people are born into it, the structure stops feeling designed and starts feeling natural. The absence of ownership no longer registers as loss because there is no remembered alternative. This is how permanence is established. A generation raised on access does not compare itself to one that owned. It compares itself only to what is available. And what is available is participation, not possession. That shift alters how power accumulates. Ownership once distributed leverage broadly. Millions of households owning homes, tools, and assets created redundancy. Risk was absorbed locally, control was diffuse, access consolidates leverage. When assets remain upstream, so does authority. Pricing power centralizes. Terms become adjustable. Behavior becomes measurable. The system gains visibility. The participant gains convenience. That trade-off compounds. As more assets remain institutionally owned, the balance of negotiation changes. Individuals negotiate within systems rather than against markets. Exit becomes costly. Alternatives thin out. Competition narrows not through conspiracy, but through efficiency. Platforms scale better than owners. Portfolios outperform households. Systems outlast individuals. This is not instability. It is consolidation. Over time, consolidation reshapes culture. People stop expecting things to last. They stop expecting costs to end. They stop expecting independence from systems that govern daily life. They plan within constraints rather than beyond them. The idea of being done fades. A mortgage paid off, a car fully owned, software purchased once, media collected permanently. These outcomes once marked progress. Now they feel outdated. Completion becomes rare. Continuity becomes normal. This changes how people relate to time. When nothing resolves, the future compresses. Planning horizons shorten. Commitments feel provisional. The long term becomes abstract. Why plan decades ahead when access can change in a year? Why anchor when mobility is rewarded? Why accumulate when systems depreciate ownership faster than use? The system does not require these questions to be answered consciously. Behavior adapts regardless. People optimize for what is rewarded. Flexibility, liquidity, responsiveness. Ownership, by contrast, is slow. It ties capital. It resists change. It creates friction. Friction is costly in systems designed for velocity. So friction disappears. The consequence is not collapse. It is endurance. A world without ownership is not fragile. It is stable precisely because it never resolves. Every relationship persists. Every payment recurs. Every dependency remains active. Revenue becomes smoother. Forecasts become easier. Authority becomes continuous. From a system perspective, this is success. From an individual perspective, it is exposure. Exposure to pricing changes. Exposure to policy shifts. Exposure to revocation. Exposure to conditions that can be modified without negotiation. The participant bears volatility. The system absorbs none. This imbalance does not produce outrage because it produces functionality. Things work. Services deliver. access continues. The cost is subtle and cumulative. Each year without ownership transfers potential equity upward. Each generation without permanence inherits fewer buffers. Each dependency reduces negotiating power. Nothing breaks, nothing explodes. The latter simply stops extending. At first, the absence is invisible. People still live somewhere, still move around, still consume, still work. But beneath that continuity, something fundamental has changed. Ownership once provided insulation against systemic failure. When systems faltered, owners retained assets. When markets shifted, owners waited them out. Access offers no insulation. When systems change, participants adjust or exit. There is nothing to hold on to. This is not hypothetical, it is structural. When housing prices rise, renters absorb it immediately. Owners do not. When services change terms, subscribers comply. Owners do not exist. When platforms disappear, access vanishes. Ownership cannot intervene. The system remains intact. The individual adapts. Over time, this adaptation becomes expectation. People stop expecting costs to decline with age. They stop expecting security to increase automatically. They stop assuming stability is something earned rather than maintained. Stability becomes conditional. That conditionality reshapes behavior. Risk tolerance decreases. Long-term commitments feel dangerous. Decisions become reversible by design. The system rewards this mindset. Flexible workers, mobile renters, subscription users, platform participants. Ownership, by contrast, resists optimization, so it becomes rare, not prohibited, just impractical. Those who retain ownership do so by exception, through inheritance, through leverage, through timing. For everyone else, access is enough. This division does not require explicit enforcement. It emerges through affordability, availability, and normalization. The result is not two classes, but two modes of existence. One accumulates assets, the other maintains access. One negotiates terms, the other accepts them. One plans beyond systems, the other plans within them. Both function, only one compounds. This is the future being inherited, not because it was chosen deliberately, but because it was optimized quietly. Ownership was not removed, it was deprioritized, and systems do not reverse optimization unless forced to. The most unsettling part is not what has been lost, but how little resistance there was. People adapted willingly because the trade-offs were incremental and the benefits immediate. Convenience replaced permanence. Access replaced autonomy. Nothing felt urgent. By the time the pattern was clear, it was already embedded. A generation raised entirely inside access-based systems will not ask for ownership back. They will not remember what it provided. They will design lives around continuity rather than completion. Careers that renew, homes that rotate, tools that expire, identities that exist within platforms. The system does not need to persuade them. It only needs to function. And it does. That is what makes the end of ownership permanent. Not collapse, not coercion, not crisis. Just a redesign that never ends. Ownership did not disappear in a moment. It faded as systems learned they no longer needed it. And what replaces it does not announce itself as loss. It announces itself as normal. By the time it is fully understood, it is no longer optional. It is simply the way things work. For more insights like this, like and subscribe.